Hey all, this is your Professor Ian. This is a brief lecture on, hold on a second, on setting. So setting in short fiction. Hence it was a dark and stormy night cartoon. Okay, so let's just jump into it now that I flubbed the beginning. So setting, I'm going to talk about a couple things, just some different ideas that go into setting. Specific versus vague setting, spatial, that just means space, the actual physical location of a setting, movement within a setting, something we don't often maybe think of. We tend to group that with plot, but I'm going to talk about it in terms of setting. Temporal, that just has to do with time, when things are set. And then details, because details are what make settings vivid and gives them the impact they do. Okay, let's jump into it. Oh, and climate as well. The outside weather conditions, seasons, things like that. We also don't maybe often think of when we're thinking about setting. Okay, so let's jump into it. So we're talking about spatial. We're talking about where the story is set, right? The where, that's spatial. Sounds like the word space related to it. So where the story is set. Are we given specific spatial details immediately? This is something we're going to see in the stories we read this semester. Some of the first stories really set the setting quickly, right? And that we're going to talk about there. We've already talked about that whole Freytag's pyramid with exposition first. A lot of stories really set things up, the setting, the spatial setting, the temporal setting right away, so we know when and where we are. Other stories withhold that information. We're going to see that with Bloodchild later in the semester, especially. You have to piece these things together. Okay. So how does a spatial setting set the tone and establish the theme, right? So where a story is set really helps to establish the theme, right? So as we saw in Araby, we read Araby earlier, that one of those first paragraphs, let me just read this. North Richmond Street, being blind, was a quiet street except for the hour when the Christian Brothers School set the boys free. An uninhabited house of 2 stories stood at the blind end, detached from its neighbors in a square ground. The other houses of the street, conscious of the decent lives lived within them, gazed at each other with brown, imperturbable faces. Right? So immediately in that story, we get this really boring suburban kind of neighborhood. These are, houses with quiet middle-class people. Nothing exciting happens here. And this is important because this is a story about a young boy who thirsts for romance. And, he has these kind of romantic visions of himself as a knight, questing for his lady. He's trying to get the chalice, all these details that come out of the story. And immediately that's set up with the spatial setting in the story. It's a very boring middle-class neighborhood, right? A perfect place for a young boy to live out these fantasies. Okay, so immediately that theme is set up with this setting, the spatial setting. Okay, you might have seen this movie. This is still from La La Land. And so the spatial setting of this movie is, part of the story they're telling. It's set in LA. They could have set the story anywhere, right? Why not Pittsburgh? Why not Philadelphia, New York, right? New York is a big city. But it's set in LA, right? La La Land, the city of dreams, right? These are 2 young dreamers who are both kind of at the bottom of the heap when we first meet them in the movie, and then achieve their dreams, but they have to give up that relationship with each other. So it's about that trade-off, right? That thing that we all have to think about. What are we willing to sacrifice for our dreams? That kind of stuff, and that's immediately established because LA has this reputation as being the city of dreams, and it carries this kind of thematic weight for the movie, right? So again, very important the movie set in LA and not somewhere else. The spatial setting is part of the story. Okay, so we also need to think about how it's revealed. Is the setting revealed through the narrative, right? As in Araby, where everything's told to us. La La Land, where we see stills. In other stories we read, that's not going to happen as much. Or the settings are being revealed in different ways. And that's a technique we can use as writers to carry our readers along with the story, revealing different parts about the setting in different ways, right? And that helps us develop the plot and characterizations along with the setting, right? For example, we're reading Secret Stream, and this is a story where setting is very important. It's about a different kind of LA. It's set in LA, but a different side of LA we don't usually think about. These secret streams in the city or in LA, and these 2 young people who are trying to find the secret places of this city, right? And that in itself is helping to create story and the meaning in the story. And they map the city and they go investigate different places. As they investigate different parts of the setting, it helps to characterize or helps to develop the character. Okay. When you think about specific versus vague setting, right? Here's from Star Wars, and this is from Gone with the Wind, right? So very specific, right? American Civil War versus that very vague setting of almost fairy tale setting of Star Wars. I'm sorry, my computer keeps going off. So, we have these specific settings. This is from 12 Years a Slave. This is, again, from Gone with the Wind. So we're taken to this very specific world with very specific people, very specific, cultural conflicts that are going on, things like this, right? And it's going to be about some of those things. We know that when it's set in that kind of specific setting. So if you choose a specific setting for your story, you're immediately bringing your reader into that world with those concerns. If you had a story, and people criticize Gone with the Wind for this very reason, it's set in the American Civil War, and it doesn't really touch on slavery that much, right? Slavery is kind of this background thing that is kind of okay in the movie. And that's one of the big criticisms of it. But immediately we're brought into that world. In this case, a much more romanticized, whitewashed version of that world compared to something like 12 Years a Slave. We can also have more vague settings, such as Star Wars or a Western, right? A Western, they'll have specific cities that it's taking place in, but the West of a Western is this kind of vague wilderness, right? Where people go to prove themselves a man or to go on some kind of quest, right? It's almost this fairy tale world within this the American imagination. And, Star Wars has this very deliberately fairy tale kind of setup, right? It's almost like Once Upon a Time. And if you read about the movie that was deliberate, right, it's based on a lot of like myth and legend stuff. So it's supposed to be that way. This kind of like vague setting. It's become more specific as the franchise has been developed by Disney and such, but it's still not really supposed to be this specific place in the same way that the antebellum South was. Okay, so setting can be vague or specific. We need to think about that. Movement. Some stories stay in one place. We're going to read a story called Lady with a Lamp in a couple weeks, and that story has no movement at all. It's just a conversation in a bedroom, and we need to think about why that is. It's just two people talking in a bedroom. Well, it's just really one person talking, as you'll see, but it's all set in a bedroom, so it's a very intimate scene where two people are just talking, right? They don't go out into the world. It's all about the concerns that these two people have about their lives, and they express that in the bedroom. We can compare that to, say, Story of an Hour, which we read, right? And I'm going to show you a map of this, but there's a definite pattern of movement in that story, right? And it's very specific, and it's part of what's happening with our character, Louise, right? Here's that movement right there. So she goes up the stairs, right? After she hears her husband's died at first, she goes up the stairs. She's upset. She locks the door in her room, and she sits down. She's looking at the window, right? She has that scene where she's looking aside, and she sees nature and such. And it's this like moment of rebirth, and she realizes she has the rest of her life ahead of us, and she goes down the stairs. She thinks to live the rest of her life in freedom, right? Goes down as a golden victory, I think is the line, or as the spirit of victory, capital V. But when she gets down there, she learns that he's still alive, and then she dies, right? So there's a definite pattern of movement that's part of it. She thinks she's free when she looks out the window. She goes up, and she's alone. She looks out the window into the world. She thinks she's free. When she has to go back down, she dies, right? So there's a definite pattern of movement that mirrors what happens with our character. You might want to think about that with your own writing. How do you get people to move around? It's kind of like a play, if you want to think about it that way. How do you block people on the stage? Temporal, so when is the story set? Are we given specific temporal details? Do we need to piece them together? In the Story of an Hour, we don't really get any specific temporal details except that we know when it was written and it seems to be of that time, right? So she doesn't tell us, oh, this takes place in the summer of 1918 or whatever. It's just implied by when the story is written and the details of the story, right? And how does that help establish the tone and the theme? It's that story is a contemporary story, or was when it was written. It's not looking backwards, and it's not science fiction. Okay, or you might think about the differences in temporal setting between Secret Stream and Araby. They're both about young men kind of having a coming of age story, dealing with love. But one is in Araby, he's looking into the far past when he was a child, And then in Secret Stream, it's about the immediate experiences of this man, Nathan. So they're very different kinds of tones, right? Araby is very like nostalgic and kind of ironic, looking back at the foolishness of his youth, whereas Secret Stream is very much more immediate. Also in temporal, does the temporal setting change? Do we go through time? Are there flashbacks? How do these shifts create meaning? Oh, we didn't look at that story, so we'll just go on. Talk about details. Remember, every word that the author uses, that you use as an author, has weight, right? You need to think about that. Don't get too worried about it, but you need to think about that when you're adding details. What do you want to describe? Remember this passage from The Story of an Hour. This is Louise when she's looking at the window at that moment of her, after she's heard her husband dies. She hasn't quite had a realization yet that she's free, that epiphany. But we get this great passage. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of the trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below was a peddler. The street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. Right, so we get multiple senses. We get it's all the same tone, right? There's a beautiful spring rebirth. There's no darkness here. There's nothing depressing. All these details add up to this beautiful, one of those beautiful experiences we all have of the spring at this moment, this lowest point in her life. So it's this turning point in the story in a way, all told through detail. The author's not telling us what we should think, but the details of this setting, of what she's seeing outside in the world, really give us an insight into her mind, right? So these are very deliberate and very good, super effective details in this scene. And pretty surprising too when you think about, she is reeling from the death of her husband, and then she has this moment that leads to her epiphany, right? And finally, climate. So what is the weather like? All right, what is the season like? Again, if we go back to this passage, before this moment, we didn't know it was spring in the story. It's only when she looks out the window that it's spring, and that's important because spring is rebirth, right? The season of rebirth. So weather, season, one term I'll introduce, pathetic fallacy. This is a literary device that attributes human qualities and emotions to inanimate objects of nature. So it's like personification. Personification is a kind of personification. Personification does the same thing, right? Like the fire licked at the curtains, right? Fire doesn't actually lick. That's a human quality, right? But it describes that movement of fire in a very picturesque way. Whereas pathetic fallacy is more about attributing human qualities to nature to show us the mindset of characters, right? So climate and season, if it's dark and stormy while you're writing a murder story and your murderer is going to find his victim and it's dark and stormy, that's supposed to reflect his mind, right? So that's what we call pathetic fallacy, is that specific kind of personification. So for example, we're reading The Lady with the Dog this week, and you're going to see that he goes to they go through different seasons in the story, and the romantic relationship that's going on in the story changes through these seasons. Okay, so those are just some things to think about with setting. Sorry the video is so long. I like to keep them shorter, but those are some things to think about as you read, especially this week's stories, The Lady with the Dog and Secret Stream. Thank you very much.